On today's episode of the Fresh Brew Run Club, I'm recapping my 2025 Glass City Marathon. Welcome to the Fresh Brew Run Club. My name is Aaron, and for today's video, I'm going to do a little recap of my 2025 Glass City Marathon. So I posted earlier my vlog from the weekend, which is just sort of my first person experience of the race. This video is going to be focused more on sort of my performance. So I'm going to talk about what went right, what went wrong. If you're watching this video and you're thinking about running the Glass City Marathon, or maybe you've signed up for the Glass City Marathon, hopefully this will be helpful to give you a breakdown of what the course is like, what it's like to run in Toledo for this marathon. So let's jump right into it. So first things first, my training. This year I did the Hanson's Marathon Method, the advanced version. So this is probably my least favorite marathon training cycle. I started my training the day after Christmas and wrapped it up at the end of April, which basically meant that I didn't get any nice weather at all. It was cold, it snowed, it rained, it was icy, it was windy. It was just pretty miserable training for this race, and it dragged on and on. The training itself went pretty well, with the exception of in the middle of my training, I had about a 9-day break where I didn't run. I got a cold. I got sick. I couldn't run. I ended up running 93% of the mileage on my schedule and 92% of the workouts on my schedule. And despite the fact that I took 9 days off, pretty much every single workout, I actually ran a little bit faster than I was supposed to. So I felt pretty strong heading into the marathon. So we'll talk a little bit about the race day morning. So here's the thing. I'm from the Detroit area. Toledo is about an hour and 20 minutes away from me. If I could do anything over again, I would actually not spend the night in Toledo. I got a hotel about 10 minutes away from the starting line. I would actually stay home, sleep in my own bed, get a good night's sleep. Since I've never run Toledo before, I didn't know how the starting line on the day of the race worked. So I wanted to make sure I got there early and got there with enough time. So I booked a hotel in the Toledo area for this race. I wish I would have just driven down the morning of. I'm up anyway. This race starts at 6:30 in the morning. So I was up at 4 a.m. anyway. I might as well have just gotten in the car and ate my banana and my bagel in the car instead of doing it at the hotel, because I got a horrible night's sleep. I think I literally got 1 hour of sleep, which is not great. Although if you've been getting good sleep in the week before, the night before the race doesn't really matter that much, but it's just nice to get a good night's sleep, just to feel comfortable, not to feel like you're in a strange place with an air conditioner that is very loud. So anyway, 1 hour of sleep. I got up at 4 a.m. on race day and I went into my little routine. I had my banana, my bagel, my Morton drink. I had a little bit of coffee. I had a little bit of electrolyte drink, and we headed out to the race. Here's the thing with the Glass City Marathon. It's not the biggest race in the world, which, some people might want, roaring crowds the entire time. You're not going to find that here, but what you will find is a very easy and efficient race to get in and out of. So the race starts and ends on the University of Toledo's campus, so there's plenty of room to spread out, plenty of parking lots. Parking was no problem. I got there and actually sat in the car for a little bit before I went to the starting line because we got there so early. So very smooth morning, absolutely no stress. Would have been fine if I just drove down. So I headed to the starting line area. Like I said, plenty of room to sort of spread out. I found the porta potties. I jumped in line. I timed it perfectly. The line was getting a little bit long by the time I was done, but I got in just in time. And then I did my warm up on a side street and just headed to the starting line. Like I said, very efficient. They got in, there were a couple speeches. The mayor gave a speech. They had the anthem. A helicopter flew over, and then they kicked off the race. So let's jump into the race. So for this race, my goal, and I don't talk too much about my goals on my YouTube channel because I don't think it's particularly impressive. That's not the point of my YouTube channel. The point is just to talk about running because I like running. But for the purposes of this video, I will talk about my goal, and that was to break 3 hours and 10 minutes in the marathon. My PR previous to this was just over 3 hours and 20 minutes at the Toronto Marathon in the fall before. So my goal is to knock off about 10 minutes from that PR. So for this race, they did not have a pace group for the full marathon at, that 3:10 mark. There was one for the half marathon. However, I made a little bit of a game time decision, which I don't regret it in hindsight, but I did decide to go out a little bit faster than what would have gotten me that 3 hour and 10 minute time. Instead of running 7:15s per mile, I decided to go out at about 7:10, 7:05 because I had been actually training for that pace the entire winter. So I felt comfortable doing that. The weather was right. There wasn't any wind. So I was like, you know what? Let's go for it. Let's bank a little bit of time in the first half. I know the second half is going to get tough, and we'll just see what happens. So the gun went off, and that's exactly what I decided to do. I pulled away from that half marathon 7:15 pace group pretty quickly. The first part of the course is great. There's a lot of fan support. You kind of do a big sort of square. There's a slight hill at about mile 4, but otherwise, nothing too crazy. Overall, this course is relatively flat. We'll get into the parts that I felt like were not very flat later, but the first 4 miles went really well. You do this big square. There are a decent amount of people, good crowd support. The sun was rising. It was just a fantastic setting. Perfect weather. It was like low 40s that day. And then you go down a decently long straightaway, and then you duck into these neighborhoods, which I think this was my favorite part of the course. So at about mile 5, you're into this beautiful neighborhood with some of the nicest houses I've ever seen. These winding roads with these trees that are gigantic. They're providing shade. It was just like extremely scenic. There was a little bit of mist in the air, so the sun is like streaming through the leaves of the trees. It was absolutely fantastic. So you run in those neighborhoods. That was very nice. Then you kind of do a little bit of a loop out by a school. Not the most scenic part of the course, but there was actually decent crowd support at a couple of the different areas of the race. My strategy for this race from a nutrition and hydration standpoint was to 1, take a Maurten gel every 30 minutes, and 2, make sure I was getting enough water throughout the course. I think that might have been one of my issues that I had in the Toronto Marathon when I struggled in the second half of that marathon. I think I might have been a little bit dehydrated, so I was being very mindful of making sure that I drank water along the course. They had Gatorade, which kind of made me nervous. They say nothing new on race day, and Gatorade would have been something new. Typically, I drink Nuun electrolyte drink. I was a little bit nervous about the sugar content of the Gatorade. I didn't want to upset my stomach and mix it in with the Maurtens. So I mostly stuck to water. There were 1 or 2 times where I did take the Gatorade, and it was pretty sweet. So I'm kind of glad I didn't load up too much on Gatorade. So you're in these fantastic neighborhoods for about the first 10 miles. There's some slight rolling hills. And for context, my definition of hills is pretty much anything that isn't flat. I know there's a lot of people that run in the mountains. So when they say that there's hills, they mean serious hills. For me, when I say there's hills, it's like I said, anything that isn't flat. So there were some slight rolling hills, but nothing too crazy. So you go through the neighborhood, and at about mile 10 and a half, you go into the Wildwood Preserve Metro Park, which is exactly that. It's a big metro park. It's kind of a more narrow path you go onto. And at mile 11, so keep this in mind if you're thinking about running this race, there is an incline for about 4 miles. So something to keep in mind. I was prepared for this. I was ready for it. At this point, 11 miles in, I was feeling pretty good. At that point, you start to get a little bit of fatigue. The adrenaline has worn off a little bit, but at that point, I was feeling good. I was running my times. I was still, running faster than that 7:15 per mile goal that I had. I was, in the 7:05, 7:10 range and felt very in control. So I was feeling good at that point, but I knew there was a decent incline coming up. It wasn't flat. So you go through this metro park, and part of this uphill is a very long straightaway. There is decent tree cover, but it's not the most exciting portion of the course. There's another version of that later in the race. Again, this is a smaller race, so if you're looking for a ton of crowd support, you're probably not going to find it. There weren't a whole lot of people lining the course cheering you on. For me, I expected it. I actually didn't mind that. I felt like when I ran the Toronto Marathon in the fall, it was overwhelming at times, so it was kind of a nice change of pace. Got halfway through, 13.1 miles, feeling good. Things were getting a little bit harder. My heart rate was starting to elevate just a little bit because, the race is dragging on. The sun is rising a little bit higher in the sky, and the incline is just going and going and going. But otherwise, the miles were kind of peeling off pretty fast. So, I was feeling pretty good at that point. You're never going to feel amazing, or at least I never feel amazing, even if I do run the best race ever. That fatigue does start to set in, once you hit halfway. So at mile 15, you go back into another neighborhood. This one didn't have as many trees, and the sun was definitely noticeable at this point. There were no clouds in the sky, so starting to become a little bit of a factor. So there's some turns in that section, and then you make a right onto a long straightaway. And as soon as I got onto this straightaway, I was like, ooh, oh boy. This is at about mile 16, and you can just see this long downhill and then this long uphill. You're running next to a very busy road, and then there's a highway that you can kind of hear, or at least I could hear it. At this point, my plan was to turn my music on at about mile 15, which didn't work. My Apple Watch would not play the playlist that I wanted, so I was just running in silence, staring down this hill. I think it's like a ravine for a river or something. So at mile 19, you get to the bottom, and then you start to climb up, which, you know, really is not the best timing in the world for the marathon. A lot of people hit the wall around mile 19, mile 20, mile 21. So you kind of begin the ascent at mile 19. And like I said, it's not the biggest hill in the world. I'll actually look it up right now. The bottom of the hill is at 621 feet of elevation, and then the top of this hill is at 665 feet. So that's about 40 feet of increased elevation, which doesn't seem like much, but at that point for me, it kind of broke me. I fought through the hill. I maintained my pace for a little while, or at least my 7:15 pace. I was running around 7:10. I slowed down, and it really felt like I was battling this hill and just doing everything I could to maintain that pace. You get to the top of the hill, you sort of take a right turn onto another straightaway-ish area, and I was cooked. It was just general fatigue. My legs were fine. My legs felt fine the entire race, which makes me think my strength was in a pretty good place. I had trained pretty well for that. I just didn't have the running fitness. Even if there wasn't a hill, I think I would have probably fallen apart a mile or two later. I was just really tired at that point. And that is one of the worst feelings in the world, where you have trained for 3 or 4 months for this day with the hope that you can run a specific time, and then you just get to a certain point and you know it's not happening. When you know you don't have it, you know you don't have it, and I knew I didn't have it at that point. I slowed down considerably, and it was just about self-preservation at that point. Then I started to do the math a little bit of okay, what do I need to do to get my PR? I'm not going to be able to run a 3:10. I want to make sure I break 3:20.25 or whatever my PR was before that. So I started doing the math and thinking okay, I need to run a sub 10 minute per mile. My easy runs were faster than 10 minute per mile, but I was nervous that hey, who knows what's going to happen over the next 6 or so miles. At that point, I had slowed down to just around 8:50 to 9 minutes per mile. So I had a little bit of extra time saved at the end, just in case, I don't know, my legs tightened up or whatever, which again, they never did. But that's a tough feeling. That's a really long 6 miles where you're not going to get the goal that you worked so hard for. You just got to drag yourself to the finish line and try to get a PR. That was the only thing that was motivating me, was if I didn't get a PR, I would have been devastated. So I wanted to keep pushing and keep pushing as hard as I could through the remaining 6 miles. Unfortunately, the remaining 6 miles of the Glass City Marathon for me were my least favorite part of the course. So you go back onto this, I think it's a bike path or a running path or some sort of somewhat narrow path with absolutely no tree cover. And at that point, it is a net downhill to the finish line, but it sure did not feel like it. It felt like I was going uphill. That's sort of the situation I was in. My stride was an absolute mess. I was just barely keeping it together as I went down this extremely sunny, shadeless path. My heart rate was spiking at that point. I'm getting passed by all kinds of people. Just not my favorite situation to be in. I knew that once I got through this long straightaway and made the first sort of turn, you kind of angle to the left a little bit, that I was almost home. So that was kind of keeping me motivated, but it just felt like the first 20 miles of that race took, 2 hours or whatever. And then the last 6 miles of the race took 3 hours. It might as well have been 5 hours. It just went on forever. And that's what people commonly say about the marathon, that it's really 2 races. It's the first 20 miles and then it's the last 6 miles. And the last 6 miles were not so fun for me. So then you go back onto Toledo's campus. You can see the stadium to your left and okay, we're almost there. I got a little second wind. I, at that point, knew I was probably going to break my PR, but I really just wanted to make sure that I finished strong. So I kind of kicked it into gear. You kind of go around the basketball stadium and then into the football stadium. Once you can see the football stadium in front of you, you're running towards it, that's when you really want to do your kick. And that's when I started my kick. Looking at the footage, my kick looks pretty pathetic. I felt like I was flying, but I was probably running 8 minutes per mile, and my stride was an absolute mess. It looked like I was running in sand or something at that point, but that's how tired I was, and I was just trying to get to the finish line. So you go into the stadium, and then you finish at about the 40-yard line on the grass. Brand new turf. It was very soft. It was very nice. And then I saw the clock, and it was just nice to cross the finish line knowing that I got my PR. So that was my race for the Glass City Marathon. So I'm definitely conflicted on my performance. On one hand, I got a PR. I'm not going to complain about getting a PR. I have never run a marathon faster. On the other hand, the last 6 to 7 miles of that race did not go according to plan. I'm not totally sure why, to be honest. I have a couple theories. One, I think I just didn't necessarily have the fitness. I stuck to the Hanson's plan, but again, I did miss a good chunk of those workouts. And where I run is pretty flat, so I tried to mix in hills as much as I could, but the hills near me are really not real hills. So when there were bigger hills at the Glass City Marathon, I wasn't totally prepared for it. I also think my fueling strategy could have played a part in it. Like I said, I didn't get muscle fatigue. Like my muscles didn't lock up. I think I just ran out of energy. I might have needed more fuel, and maybe if I would have brought a handheld with me, some carbs or, something else, maybe the Morton gels, just didn't work for me at that point. This is now back-to-back races where I've tried to break 3:10 and I've fallen apart in the second half. I got a little further in this race, so making slight progress, but I just had a really rough last 7 miles. So overall, I feel good about it. I have a PR, I'm fine with that. But when I think about this race, the number one thing in my mind is just those last 7 miles that were such a struggle and were just very much not fun. So I want to talk post-race a little bit. You go through the chute. The nice thing about this race is you're on the football field and there's like so much room. It's not like running in a downtown area where, like the Toronto Marathon, for example, I had to walk literally a quarter mile through the chute before you could get out into this plaza that was the most chaotic thing I've ever experienced in my life. This was like plenty of room. You could spread out. If you wanted to lay down on the ground, you could do that. I don't think they were stopping anyone from doing that. The one thing I noticed or didn't notice was water and like bananas or bagels at the end of the race. I thought I just missed it, but in my vlog, in the comments of my vlog, there were a couple people that were like, yeah, there was no water or bananas at the end of that race, which is kind of weird. Thankfully, my wife brought a Gatorade for me to drink after the race. Otherwise, I would have been absolutely parched. So I don't know where any of that stuff was. I hope they had it and I just missed it. But then again, kind of bad that I missed it. Maybe it should have been in a better place. I don't know. Whatever, wasn't that big a deal for me because I was a little bit prepared with the stuff I brought. So then you go out of the stadium into this like big parking lot where it's kind of a post-race party. They didn't have water and bananas, but they did have pizza and beer. I won't lie, it was pretty terrible pizza. And as far as the beer goes, I think when you run a marathon, your kidneys are functioning at like 10 or 15%. So drinking beer, not the greatest idea at that point in your life. So I sat down and tried to eat my dry pizza for a little bit and drink some Gatorade. But then I headed out after the race. It was a cool atmosphere for sure. If I was feeling better, it would have been cool to kind of hang out there for a little bit, but I just wanted to get back to the hotel and take a shower. So overall, like I said, my performance, mixed bag. I'm happy with it, but I kind of have a little bit of regret. Not regret. I don't know what I would regret. I don't know what I would have done differently besides like a completely different training plan or trying to mix in like weightlifting or I don't know, different fueling strategy. That's all stuff that like, I don't know. I'll figure out. So overall, like I said, I'm glad I got a PR. Tough finish. The event itself was fantastic. It was well run. It was efficient. It's a little bit of a smaller race, which has its advantages. It's so easy to get in and out of there. You have plenty of space to stretch and sort of spread out before and after the race. And it is really well run. Like it was very efficient. There was no bottlenecks. There was no madness at the end of the race like there was at the Toronto Waterfront Marathon. It's just a great overall race. I would say that it's a runner's race. It's a place where you go and you're just there to run. Whether you're trying to qualify for Boston, you're trying to get a PR. It doesn't have all the bells and whistles of like the big marathons where they take place in like a huge city or, there's sweeping mountain vistas or there's crowd support with, really creative signs all the way along the course. Like this is a race where you just show up and you're there to run. And I really appreciated that. I did have a lot of fun. I did enjoy it. So if you are thinking about running Glass City and you're fine with the fact that there might not be big crowds or anybody cheering for you for a majority of the course, I would definitely check it out. It's a fantastic race, and I'm really glad I did it. So with that said, let me know if you have any questions in the comments below. At this point, I'm excited to take a little bit of a break from training really hard for marathons. I do plan on coming back at some point, probably next year, and you know, going back to the drawing board a little bit. I might be, you know, in the market for a new training plan. I might try to work in some weightlifting or have a different nutrition plan. Just try to switch it up, because I feel like I might potentially be peaking with how I'm training for marathons at this point in my life. So excited to eventually get back out there, but even more excited to take a little bit of a break. So that will be my video recapping the 2025 Glass City Marathon. Thank you for watching. Subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you soon.